So welcome to the second night of the Birds and Bees Festival. We're really glad you're here with us. My name is Dana Ripper. I'm the co-founder and co-director, along with my husband, Ethan Duke, of the Missouri River Bird Observatory based in Arrow Rock, Missouri. We established the Birds and Bees Festival in 2019. And of course, it was canceled in 2020, and here we are in 21, and we're doing this hybrid format. And I'm actually really excited about that, and I'll tell you why exactly in a couple seconds. I want to thank the folks that were just on the happy hour just now. It was a lot of fun, and we appreciated getting to know some more people. So for folks that weren't able to join us last night, I just wanted to point out a couple things about the virtual part of the festival. Please do check out our sponsors. We're very grateful to the organizations and to the individuals that sponsored this festival. Also our exhibitors. Hopefully some of you were able to hang out with the Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever folks in their booth this afternoon. And I wanted to point out that Deep Roots, which is an awesome native plant organization out of Casey, they're doing a giveaway in their booth. So, be sure to check out all of the exhibitors, but some of them are doing cool giveaways. So do look into that. So a thing that I think is maybe the best part of doing the Birds and Bees Festival in this hybrid format is our diversity of speakers, both in topic and in geography. So I know some of you have, spent the last couple of days with us. You've seen speakers from all over the place. Last night we had Mary Phillips with the National Wildlife Federation speaking to us from just outside of DC in Maryland. And tomorrow, of course, we have Doug Tallamy coming to us from Delaware. And so tonight we have Scott Black of the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation coming to us from just outside Portland, Oregon. And so my favorite part of this is that we're getting speakers from everywhere. I'm not sure that we could have pulled together so many awesome speakers over 3 days would it not be for this sort of format. So I was able to watch a talk by Scott near the beginning of the pandemic last year, and I found it riveting and fascinating. And when we went to go to put this festival together, I was super excited to be able to get Scott to come speak to us. So please check out by the end of his talk, I will not have to, encourage you to check out Xerces.org, but please remember to do so. It's an amazing organization. And Scott, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana. And thanks everybody for showing up on a Friday night. I'm sure there's other things you could be doing tonight, and instead you're here, which is pretty neat. So thanks for that. I'm really fortunate in that I get to speak, or before the pandemic, used to get to speak to audiences around the country and around the world, really speak to them. Now, since the pandemic, I've done a lot of these Zooms, which I think are really neat in a way, because both the ability to bring in a speaker from far away, it's neat that I'm able to talk to people that I might not normally be able to reach. So I think we're making the best of this. But I like to do all my thank yous first, so that I make sure to really thank the people that are responsible for me being here, because it takes quite a few people to make that happen. And first and foremost, I really want to thank Dana and the Missouri River Bird Observatory and all of the organizers of this festival. The content and the speakers just excellent at this festival. I also really need to thank my wife and kids. They both inspire and empower me to do this work. I'm really able to do this work and have a drive to do it because of them. I need to thank the many people that help Xerces stay afloat. We have over 14,000 members. We work with well over 100 scientists around the world, federal, state, and local agencies, hundreds and hundreds of farmers, companies, private foundations, and tens of thousands of community scientists and everyday people that that take action for invertebrates. So we can't do that without all of this big tent and the big partnerships that we have. And I do want to point out that we are a member supported nonprofit. You know, nonprofits survive based on your giving. So, you know, thinking about the Missouri River Bird Observatory or other local nonprofits, as well as if there's extra Xerces, this really is our lifeblood. I also want to thank our incredible staff working in every state working on invertebrate conservation. We have staff in 18 states, but they work throughout the United States on conservation issues, and they're really doing the hard work of conservation every day. So for those of you who have never heard of the Xerces Society or don't know much about us, I thought I'd better tell you just a tiny bit. It's pronounced the Xerces Society, and we're actually named after the first butterfly known to go extinct due to humans, the Xerces blue butterfly. It went extinct in the 1940s as San Francisco expanded. And Robert Michael Pyle, who founded our organization in 1971, really felt that there should be an organization focused on the smaller animals, the butterflies, the bees, and the other insects and invertebrates that are out there. And he thought the Xerces Society was an apt name for this organization. And we work through a variety of platforms, really holistically on our conservation efforts. First and foremost, we're a science-based organization, and we work to understand the habitat and management needs of both the species and species groups that we work on. We also harness people because there just aren't enough academic scientists and not enough Xerces staff in the world to truly get at all these unanswered questions. And we've got Bumblebee Watch, as well as Monarch Thanksgiving Counts and Pond Watch and other efforts. I do want to point out that in Missouri right now, we also are doing a Bumblebee Atlas, which I know Katie talked about in a lightning talk. She's a staffer at Xerces, and I will talk more about or briefly mention a little later in my talk. We also do a lot of education and outreach because you really can't make change unless you can reach people. And we've directly reached over 150,000 people really across the world and many, many millions more through publications, media, and other sources. Yeah, I really put this in here mainly because I can dress up okay. I look okay in a suit. This, of course, is pre-pandemic. And Xerces is an outspoken advocate for conservation. We really believe that science and advocacy can go together, and that oftentimes scientists have to be and should be advocating for policies. And then last but not least, it's really about the animals that we focus on. Xerces has worked to protect and restore over 2.5 million acres of habitat for a whole swath, dozens and dozens and dozens of animals out in the landscape. So today I'm going to talk about insects and insect decline. And my talk is based on a few fairly recent papers that I helped author. The first one called Declines in Insect Abundance and Diversity, We Know Enough to Act Now, which came out in 2019. And then a paper that came out just in January called 8 Simple Actions That Individuals Can Take to Save Insects from Global Declines. You should also, if you're interested in this topic, look at the latest issue from PNAS. They did a whole issue on global decline in insect, which my 8 Simple Actions article with my colleagues was part of. So I'm going to talk about importance. I'm going to talk about evidence of decline, what's causing it, and then I'm going to really focus on solutions because we have to understand, and I've got to delve deep into the problems, which are a little depressing, but really, if we want to get out ahead of these problems, we've got to act. So why care about these animals? Well, first and foremost, Insects and their allies represent the vast majority of described animal species on the planet. This is a pictogram, and you can see up in the top left-hand corner, there's a little bear, and that denotes all the species of mammals. And over on the right, a large beetle that denotes all of the species of insects. When you add up insects and crustaceans and mollusks and annelids, you can see that these animals make up the vast majority of animals on the planet. And what's even more startling is what we don't know and what we haven't discovered. There are about 1.4 million invertebrates that have been identified, but there are likely another 7 million insects and other invertebrates that have not. So really, this incredible diversity has led to invertebrates occupying a great number of niches, all over the planet in terrestrial, freshwater, aquatic, as well as marine systems. Invertebrates are also the heavyweights of the planet. Oh, did I somehow pause? Let me know, Dana, if you can still see my screen moving. Invertebrates are also the animal heavyweights of the planet. Research from Costa Rica has found that invertebrates made up more than 90% of terrestrial and animal biomass in the forest.
Scott, we're on the importance diversity slide.
Okay, I see what I did there. I'm going to go back, and I messed up and hit this at the top of the screen. Even though I do this all the time, I am, for some reason, resume slideshow. Here we go. All right, can you see that now, Dana?
Yep, importance biomass, right?
All right, yep. And as I said, studies from the rainforest have showed that insects make up more than 90% of animal biomass. But it's not just rainforests. I don't show a lot of data slides, but this is from a really neat study that came out in 2018 that basically showed biomass of all living things on the planet. And if you look at the left side, you'll see that it's got plants and animals and fungi, and you'll see that plants really make up the vast majority of biomass on the planet. But if you look at that small square at the bottom right, you can see that once you look at animals, arthropods in red, annelids, mollusks, nematodes, really make up the majority of animal biomass. So I like to say that plants and insects really are the fabric of the planet. They are really driving these systems. And why is that important? This diversity and this biomass really equates to services, or what I call services. Services like food for animals. Invertebrates are everywhere, and other animals eat them. 96%, for instance, of songbirds rear their young on invertebrates. We would not have fish in our streams without invertebrates. Even grizzly bears rely on invertebrates. It's pretty interesting. The two main food sources of grizzly bears are salmon, which need small invertebrates, especially as they're young in the streams where they're born. And the second major diet is berries, which are pollinated by insects. So really, grizzly bears, as well as a vast majority of other animals on the planet, either rely directly or secondarily on insects. Insects also help decompose our waste. Without them, we'd be neck deep in this stuff. They are the first line of breaking down both animal, plant, and human waste. And of course, everybody I think knows by now that insects are incredibly important for pollination. More than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, mostly an insect, to move pollen. And the dollar value is pretty startling when you start to tease out how much insects are worth to our economy. a very conservative estimate in a study done by Mace Vaughn, actually from Xerces, and John Losey from Cornell from 2006, showed that that just a few services were worth $57 billion a year to our economy. That'd be about $70 billion in today's economy. So I hope that shows you just how important these animals are. We cannot take them for granted. But unfortunately, they are in decline. And this is not a slide out of place. People are wondering why I'm showing a car. Well, this was my car when I was a young man. This is a 1971 Mach 1 Mustang, which I drove across Nebraska many, 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 many times. I grew up in eastern Nebraska. I went to school in western Nebraska, and I was often driving back and forth across the state to see old friends and go back to school. And one of the things I had to do all the time was clean my car. It was covered in insects. This was back in the 1980s. And what was interesting is when I started going back to Nebraska after I started working at Xerces in a much more fuel efficient car with my wife and oldest daughter at the time, I really thought I noticed something different. And that was I could drive all the way across Nebraska and not have nearly as many insects on my windshield. I started to think something might be wrong, and I emailed many colleagues from across the world and said, I think I'm seeing something new. I'd been working on declining rare insects that needed specific habitat requirements. But I started to really think I noticed that I was just seeing less insects altogether. And what was really interesting is people from Europe, people from Canada, people from other parts of the world emailed me back and said, yeah, we think we're seeing the same thing. And it was coined the windshield effect by many of us because we were just thinking we were seeing less insects on the windshield. Now, I got to caution, though, that this is not science. Our perceptions over time can change, and we really needed more information about this topic. But unfortunately, since then, when many of us have started to look into this, we really have been able to detail that insects are indeed declining. Study after study shows this. And I think first and foremost, these studies started to look at pollinators. And, you know, of course, honeybees are a managed insect, and we are having trouble with keeping enough hives. But honeybees actually will not go extinct. There are more honeybees on the planet now than ever because we manage these animals across the world. And as we got beyond looking at managed insects into our other pollinators, really the information that we were getting was really concerning. But as I showed in some earlier slides, insects and their groups are really diverse. They're hard to study, and they're hard to understand what's going on. And so we and many others started looking at specific groups of insects to see whether we could tease some of these issues out. And one of the first groups we looked at were bumblebees because they're a manageable fauna. There are about 57 bumblebee species in Canada, the US, and Mexico. And in an analysis that my staff did working with the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, we found that 28% of bumblebees in North America were threatened, 41% in Mesoamerica. And our colleagues in Europe found that 23% are also threatened. These are large numbers, over a quarter of bumblebees, and in Mesoamerica, almost up, creeping up towards half of the bumblebees are threatened. And this is epitomized by the rusty patch bumblebee. This species has declined by 90% across its range. The rusty patch was one of the more common bumblebees across its range. It was one that probably anybody who lived in these areas likely saw in their yard, in field edges, in parks. And this became the first bee in the continental US to be protected under the Endangered Species Act. Now, there are 3 species in Missouri on this list, Bombus fraternus, Pennsylvanicus, and variabilis. And so this is a trend that we're seeing in groups, is that many species within certain groups are declining. Just wanted to point out that we've got a bumblebee atlas in Missouri, as well as Nebraska, California, the Pacific Northwest, and soon to be other states in the Midwest. And you can be part of it. We've got some great partners that we're working with, and check it out. All you got to do is type in a Missouri Bumblebee Atlas into your browser, and you'll be able to find it. Butterflies are another well-studied group. And unfortunately, we're seeing really the similar trends in butterflies as we are with our bumblebees. And it's all over wherever they're studied. In the UK, trends show that 52% of butterfly species have declined in abundance, and 47% of geographic ranges have shrunk. In a monitoring program in Flanders, which is a region of Belgium, 19 of the original 64 species that lived in these areas are now gone. And of course, we all know about decline of the monarch butterfly and other species that used to be everywhere, and now we're seeing fewer and fewer of. Another of those species that's found in Missouri is the regal fritillary, which historically was found nearly statewide, but it's now found in only a few tallgrass prairie remnants. Beautiful big butterfly. But it's not just a few butterfly species, and that's what we're starting to see. More and more studies that are looking at trends in abundance over time, and abundance kind of can track biomass as well, has found that in Ohio, for instance, in this study, that butterflies are declining by 2% a year, a 33% reduction in butterfly abundance over a 20-year period. That's large decline. And this really seems to be an issue wherever we look. A report that I worked on with hundreds of other authors, it's a UN report, found that likely over 40% of invertebrate pollinator species may be facing extinction over the next decade or two. But it's not just our pollinators. It's pretty much all the insect groups that are studied. In the upper Midwest, mayfly biomass declined by over 50%. Now, I do want to say a caveat. We have seen a few studies in aquatic areas where the water quality was really terrible, and where that has been improved through conservation measures. We've seen an actual increase in abundances. And I'll talk a little about that in the solution section, because there are things we can do to stem the tide and hopefully start to improve this situation. But first, I have to depress you. A third of tiger beetle species and subspecies are likely threatened and endangered. And really across time, space, and taxonomic lineage, it's really interesting. We're just seeing similar trends of groups studied of declines of 1% to 2% a year, which of course, as you can imagine, is not sustainable. And, you know, I've worked much of my life on species conservation. My favorite, species, the Mardon skipper or the regal fritillary or other butterflies or bees or vertebrates that I've worked on. But this really issue rises above that because the current crisis is larger than an individual species issue. And we're starting to creep towards losing key ecological functions and really having a cascade effect. Remember that these are food for other animals, that they pollinate, that they do all these services. So what are the issues? Well, it's really us. We are not allowing room for these animals in the way we grow food, in the way we build our houses and live our lives. And habitat loss is likely the most influential factor, but by no means the only factor that we have. And it's really habitat loss. And I do want to point out, it's not just terrestrial habitat, aquatic habitats as well. They've been lost at greater rates than a lot of our terrestrial habitats have. But it's also habitat degradation. You know, sometimes you'll see on one side of the fence habitat loss. It may be a cropping situation or a bluegrass lawn, and on the other side of the fence, it's mowed all the time, so there's no habitat. It's just degraded. And so we really need to think about this as the 1-2 punch. We lose habitat, but we're often degrading other habitat through overgrazing or overmowing or invasive species or too much fire or not enough fire, conifer encroachment. The list goes on and on. So when I say habitat loss, really we need to, when we talk about habitat, we need to talk about habitat loss and degradation. But pesticides are also a major issue, a major issue, and that can't be overstated. And this is certainly on farms, and it's certainly large-scale pesticides for mosquito management or out here in the West for grasshopper control. But I do want to point out that before we point the finger at everybody else, we also need to be pointing the finger at ourselves, because some studies show that more pesticides are used per acre in urban and suburban areas than in many ag areas. And this is in the quest for the perfect lawn and the perfect rows. And you know, we're poisoning these animals for aesthetics, which is really a problematic. There are many other issues, though. You know, I think habitat loss and pesticides, two of the big ones, but disease. We live in a global society, and we move animals around the planet. And rusty patch bumblebee and other bumblebees, likely one of the causes, along with pesticides especially, and habitat loss, for a decline in those animals is spread of disease from commercial bumblebees. Honeybees can also spread diseases to some of our native species. So we need to be thoughtful if we're going to be moving animals around the planet. And it's not just disease. We often move animals that eat other animals. This picture is the 9-spotted lady beetle that's been extirpated from large areas by competition of 2 non-native lady beetles that ate it and competed with it, that were released for biological control. So we are trying to sometimes do the right thing by using these organisms to control other insects and have these unintended consequences. A parasitoid fly released for biological control is implicated in declines of 4 large silk moth species in the Northeast. And in a study in Hawaii, 83% of the parasitoid species reared from native moths were former biological control agents. We really need to get a handle on moving and releasing animals into these environments. Things like lights. We have a lot of lights on this planet, and they impact night flying insects like fireflies and moths. Not going to go into a deep dive, but Xerces does have a firefly conservation campaign. Go to our website. We've got resources for land managers and others on what you can do to help fireflies. And then climate change. Climate change kind of overlays everything else, and climate exerts powerful effects on the distribution and abundance of these animals. And this warming is already generating change to many insect populations. And new studies suggest that climate may be as major a driver of decline of wild bees and butterflies as habitat loss and pesticides. So it's really all in tandem. And as Dave Wagner, a noted insect ecologist, coined, it's really death by 1,000 cuts. As you can see in this pictogram, you know, the top pictures are much about climate change. but then we've got habitat loss, introduced species, poisons like pesticides, and it's all of them together. And as we think about these issues, we can't take a single-minded approach. We have to think about all the issues that are affecting these species and what we can do about it. So what can we do about it? That's really what I want to talk about for the rest of this time. And I'm really going to focus on nature-based climate solutions, because where we are with the climate crisis right now, if we don't think about climate in all that we do in our conservation, our gains may be short-lived. We've got to start thinking about what is this planet going to look like in the next decade, in the next 2 decades, in the next 50 years, so our conservation actions will have the greatest impact. And if we hope to stem the losses in insects and the services they provide, you know, we all have to take steps at every level. We've got to restore, enhance native plant habitats for insects across all landscapes, from wildlands to farmlands to urban cores, and everything in between. And you know, although we do need to focus on terrestrial habitat, and terrestrial habitat conservation actually does help aquatic resources, but we also need to think about the aquatic resources themselves, because many of our at-risk invertebrates are freshwater residents, and they're vital for fish as well as for birds, because many birds use water bodies, streams, rivers, lakes, wetlands for a large amount of their food for where they gather insects. And although we've got research gaps in our understanding of climate change, it really is clear that insects need, of course, high quality habitat, but they also need to be moving across the landscape. We need to be thinking about travel corridors and stepping stone habitats, because there's already data showing that these species are moving. And there's some data now showing that where they can move across the landscape, those populations are doing better than where populations cannot move across the landscape because there is no habitat corridors or stepping stones. And we have to reduce stressors such as pesticides. Gotta be part of the issue. And really, we have to tackle biodiversity and climate change at the same time, because really it's kind of a win-win or a lose-lose. You know, biodiversity plays an important role in climate mitigation and adaptation, thus making a key contribution to our efforts on climate change. At the same time, meeting mitigation targets is essential to avert biodiversity loss. A modeling study showed that even without habitat loss, pesticides, any other issues, if we get up to 3 degrees Celsius, over what we are now, insects will likely lose half of the habitat that they now inhabit. So therefore, it's really impossible to address biodiversity loss without addressing climate change. And it's equally impossible to do the opposite. And these nature-based solutions can really help us. And researchers are working out methods that are best suited to do both. We can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions related to land use. We can capture and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by using certain plants, and we can improve the resilience of ecosystems, helping plant and animal, including humans, communities adapt to the climate change. And again, we have to think about this with a holistic approach. And I like to say that natural areas are the glue that holds all habitat together. Vegetation management and restoration really needs to maximize the diversity of the native plant resources and the insects that rely on these native plants. And grazing, fire management, mowing, recreation can be either done in a way that minimizes these resources or in a way that maximizes these resources. And we really have to think about our management in these areas, because again, they really are the biodiversity reservoirs that we have left. And I do want to point out, it's not all about restoration in any landscape, certainly not in natural areas, but in other landscapes as well. I know when pollinator conservation, when the fire got lit under everybody to do pollinator conservation, I heard the rallying cry, restoration, restoration, restoration. And it was kind of like the Johnny Wildflower seed approach to pollinator conservation. And I saw some projects that were really good, and right near them, I would see natural habitat still being highly degraded. There are often opportunities to better manage existing habitat for the betterment of insects. And by doing that and managing existing habitat, it's often less expensive and more impactful. So we really should be thinking about what's left and how can we best manage it, and then thinking about, okay, what's destroyed or destroyed enough that we have to enhance it or restore it. And Xerces does work with land managers across North America to try to understand these land management issues and best practices that can be done for fire, for grazing, for invasive species removal. And this is going to be key to our success. But it's not just these natural areas. The other side of the coin are the towns and cities. And 80% of people in the US live in towns and cities. They have to be part of the solution. And invertebrate conservation, that's the neat thing about it, is it can happen at any scale. Even bee lawns, urban meadows, little habitats like this can be really useful from an insects or from multiple species of insects point of view. And Xerces has worked with dozens, actually hundreds of cities on projects to plant habitat, to minimize or ban toxic insecticides on city property. Cities want to do this work. They often just need the help to make it done. And wanted to point out that Xerces manages something called Bee City USA. We have over 200 cities and campuses as part of this effort. And the idea is the city takes on, they basically pass a resolution that says they will do things for pollinators. They'll plant habitat, they'll do outreach and education, and they'll put together an integrated pest management plan. There actually are 4 entities in Missouri that are part of our city and campus network. Forsyth, hopefully that's how you pronounce it, Crestwood, University of Missouri, and Mineral Area Colleges. So if you work for a city or volunteer at a city, go to our Bee City website and check out those resources. And this is really impactful. In 2019 alone, our Bee City network, with their energy and power and just our help, completed 876 pollinator habitat projects, as well as many other pesticide projects. And they reached over 800,000 people with a message of pollinator conservation. This can really be a way to amplify these messages more broadly, because we do need everybody to be involved. And, I grew up in Omaha. People don't think of it as a big city, but it seemed big to me. We lived in the middle of Omaha, and I'm the youngest of 10 kids. We didn't go to far-flung natural areas, didn't go on big trips to the West Coast or anything. And I was lucky enough to have an area a block and a half from my house that had not yet been built into houses. It had a little ephemeral stream, it had a little forest, it had a little meadow. And that's where I fell in love with nature. I would catch snakes and lizards and and catch fireflies at night and butterflies by day. And we need that nature close to home because, again, I think that this is where a lot of the people live, and yet they're divorced from this natural setting. And you don't need tigers or bears or wolves to have nature. Don't get me wrong, tigers, bears, and wolves are vital. We need to conserve them. But in a city setting, a bumblebee can be a source of wonder and intrigue to a kid. And we're working now with certain cities to take an even deeper dive, to look at how we can work holistically across a city to address both biodiversity loss and climate change. In Santa Fe, we're working to build a connected climate smart pollinator habitat. And we're identifying core habitat and in corridors and working to strategically and interconnect these. We're also starting a project with Boulder, Colorado, and we hope to do more of this work in the future. Wanted to point out that, you know, we've got natural areas, we've got cities. What's in between? A lot. And roadsides, there's 10 million acres of roadsides in the US. And if properly managed and restored, they could provide habitat for a whole variety of animals. So we need to think about spaces differently. This doesn't need to be mowed grass. This can be habitat. And there are lots and lots of opportunities for this. We work with DOTs all across departments of transportation, all across the country on habitat projects and doing training. And right now we're also working with elected officials to try to add language to the upcoming infrastructure bill that would provide funding to do more work along roadsides, which we hope will be included in that and hope that will pass. Also in between maybe natural areas and cities are agricultural areas, which are of course vital to feed us, but they're also vital in our quest for biodiversity conservation and climate change. About 40% of the land on our planet is used for agriculture. And fence row to fence row farming, intensive pesticides, soil degradation, conversion of what is natural habitat to agriculture, we need to start minimizing that and replacing it with ecological intensification and regenerative farming and agroecology. This will take some time, but it can and must be done if we're going to be successful. And this is one place, I mean, lots of places where this comes in, but in agriculture where restoration is a really, really vital component. It's taking oftentimes areas of farms that aren't that well used for cropping anyway and putting them back into some natural habitat. And there are many ways to do that and think about agricultural nature-based climate solutions that can both help biodiversity as well as help mitigation and adaptation efforts. And there are many strategies that we can use and options on any farm that both can help bring in pollinators, often for pollinated crops, support biodiversity, and support carbon sequestration in the ground. From flowering hedgerows to cover crops, to beetle banks and insectary strips, riparian buffers. There's just many, many of them. For instance, cover crops have the potential to improve soil fertility, increase yields, and retain soil moisture to mitigate the effects of drought. We work a lot with farmers to do cover crops within their cropping systems. And that's similar with rangeland. We can manage rangeland in a way that maximizes biodiversity and increases the health of the herd, which seems to me like a real win-win, and will help with climate as well. Hedgerows, you know, hedgerows have been used for 1,000 years in England, and actually it's where some of the rarest insects are when you go to England, and they provide many different benefits. And Xerces works across the United States with farmers on many, many habitat projects, from big habitat projects in California. Some of these plantings are miles long. At one area, we planted a 7-mile hedgerow, like this one, which is over a mile. And many of our projects are in areas with little or no other habitat, really making them vital if we hope to bring biodiversity back into these landscapes. This is an almond orchard, and if you look here, you can see a tiny little, well, it's a big truck in this landscape. But this works in many, many landscapes, vegetable farms, large-scale wheat production in Montana, biodynamic farming in New York. We've worked with farmers all over on many, many of these projects. This is a project I wanted to point out because one of my staff has worked with the folks that did this project. This is a farm owned by Frank Oberle. I hope I got that right. And they cleared the cedars out. And this was in partnership with NRCS and the Missouri Department of Conservation. This type of project supports biodiversity, but also is supporting our climate objective as well. But, it's easy to go out and plant flowers, but it's not all about the flowers, as I mentioned. To solve our insect decline, biodiversity, and climate crisis, we have to minimize the impacts of pesticides in all landscapes. We use more pesticides now than at any time in history, and we often use them unnecessarily in agriculture, and in urban landscapes. And many studies show, unfortunately, that pesticides are a leading threat to the conservation of insects. And the real issue is that pesticides don't stay where you put them. We apply them and they move off of where we apply them. And they move in many, many different ways. They can move as dust from seed coatings, as spray drift, leaching, the movement, subsurface movement into watersheds, wind erosion. And so we need to be really thoughtful about where and how we're doing conservation projects, because you can't just put a conservation project anywhere if these conservation projects are going to be impacted by large-scale pesticide use. We did a study in California, and we could not find a single sample, even in wild areas in the Central Valley of California, that milkweed, monarch's only real host plant, didn't have some residue from insecticides. The worst residue and the multiple contaminants were in conventional farming and in urban areas or towns and cities. But we found them even on organic farms and in natural areas. And I know a lot of people talk about neonicotinoids, and we have to take action on these highly toxic systemic insecticides. These are really the bad actors because they can have residue in pollen and nectar. They can be persistent for years in plant tissue, up to 2 years in soil, and they're highly mobile and move across the landscape. But to really do this right, we have to go beyond neonics. We got to move to a more ecologically based integrated pest management approach, or we're not going to meet our objectives. And we really try to do that through, we've got partnerships with NRCS, we've got partnerships with states, we work with farmers, and we've got the only third-party certification program for pollinators called Be Better Certified. It promotes farm management that takes a real strong emphasis on habitat and pesticides. And that if it's if a third party is certifying it and you see this label, Be Better Certified or organic, you're supporting the farmer as well as biodiversity. But we also need to take action, have our government take action at all levels. It's not just about us, and that's what I like to say. We need to make changes in our own lives, but our governments really need to step up. Our governments across the world need to start promoting policies that protect, restore, and habitat, and reduce pesticide use and address climate change in a meaningful way. So we need to take our own steps, whether you're a farmer or you live in city or town, or you're a wildlife manager or a park manager, but we also need our governments to do a better job. And in conclusion, I would say one of the key take-home messages that I have found from my many years, I'm not saying I'm totally old, but I am kind of old, from my many years of conservation is that partnerships are key. Xerces doesn't own any land, right? So working with land managers, researchers, other nonprofits, neighbors, the farmers themselves, local communities really pays off. And coordination and communication are really two keys to success. We have to effectively communicate, and we have to effectively coordinate. And we also need to actively engage communities that we might not be used to engaging. The conservation community, including Xerces, has a lot of work to do to grow inclusivity so that BIPOC and all communities can feel welcome in our work. And we also all must practice reciprocity to ensure that we are showing up for our partners and expanding our partnerships equitably. If people are showing up for us, we need to be showing up for them. And you don't even need a lawn. You don't even need a landscape to work on, although that's great. You can change your garden into a mecca for insects. But all people have a role. You can become a community scientist. You can go out today, look up the Bumblebee Atlas, and you just go out, you find bumblebees, you take a picture, you upload them, you try to identify them, but we have a team of scientists that verify those identifications. It is directly helping us with conservation. You can support this with your pocketbook, buying organic, sustainable agriculture. If you see Be Better certified out there, you can curb your carbon footprint by eliminating unneeded travel. We haven't been traveling much, and I know we're all hot, chomping at the bit. But maybe when we start traveling again, maybe we should all travel less. And also eating less meat is going to be needed. We need to do all these things, and then support candidates who care about science and conservation. We really do need to change that dynamic. Science is not a dirty word. Conservation is not a dirty word. But really the good news, and what I will end with, is that this works. You can actually do habitat projects, whether they're management, whether they're restoration, lots of things in between, that work. These animals will show up back in these landscapes, and they work on real time scales. And they work whether you're improving your yard and putting in a lot of native plants to attract animals. They work if you're a farmer and putting in cover crops or hedgerows and thinking about your pesticide use. They work if you're a land manager and you start to understand the overall biodiversity and when should I burn, what should I burn, how should I graze. These work, and we can increase the diversity and abundance in these landscapes, and that's what we all need to be focused on. So with that, just want to throw out that Xerces has, as Dana mentioned, go to our website. We've got a tremendous number of useful publications, many of them free. You can also buy our various books, Gardening for Butterflies, Attracting Native Pollinators. We've got 2 new books out, or newer books out, 100 plants for bees and 100 plants for monarchs. But most of these you can certainly just download for free. And just take a baby step, take an action. Tell your friends what you're doing and get a community involved. And that's what really it's going to take. And work with your local nonprofits, because they're leaning in to try to do this good work as well. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for taking your Friday evening to listen to me talk about a really important topic that I hope I didn't depress you too much. I hope I depressed you just enough so that the action part of it will engage you to take some steps. So thanks so much for taking the time to listen.
Thank you so much, Scott. There were a couple things that I forgot to say at the beginning because I was super excited to get to your presentation, and now everyone knows why that is. One is that folks, please feel free to put your questions in the Whova Q&A or Whova chat or the Zoom chat. Some folks did already do that, so we do have some questions for you, Scott. I also wanted to point out that so for instance, Xerces' own Katie Lamke presented yesterday here at the festival at 11 about the Missouri Bumblebee Atlas. The recording of that is up on the Whova website, and you'll get a link to it also. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that particular Xerces effort and how you can get involved as a community scientist here in Missouri, check out that presentation. So a few questions here. So we'll start off with the first one is, what can farmers use rather than pesticides?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do want to point out that the Missouri Bumblebee Atlas is a real partnership with Pheasants and Quail Forever, the Missouri Department of Conservation, and the University of Missouri. So want to make sure it is a Xerces project, but we're really excited to be working with partners as I mentioned. So I wanted to give them a shout out because we couldn't do it without them. So, rather than talk about any one thing that you can use instead of pesticides, what I like to talk about is a more holistic approach, which is called integrated pest management. Through integrated pest management, or ecological pest management, as I like to call it, you start to understand your system, and you can really dial back on some of the inputs that you would use to get the same yields or the same amount of money for your cropping system. So the way that you get degrees in integrated pest management, and I've taken lots of classes, but the very Cliff Note version is, first you need to understand your crop and your pests. What are the major pests of your crop? Then you need to do good scouting so that you understand when certain benchmarks are hit, and those are the levers to take action. You need to understand your crop enough to know what cultural supports you might have. There might be certain ways to rotate crops, or there might be certain things you can do to minimize pest outbreaks before you even think about some pesticide that you would use. Then if you hit a high enough level, you need to think about what are the pesticides that you could use that might have the minimal impact, and how can you use them in a way that minimally impacts the surrounding landscape. So in this system, you might not give up all pesticides if you're right now a commercial grower, but you really understand your system better, so you dial it back. Right now, we've really moved, in at least many farmers, to kind of a prophylactic use of pesticides. whether it's seed treatments or other just rotation of pesticides just to keep pest levels down. And we need to start moving out of that. You can also look at your other farmers in the area or in other areas that are growing organically. Organic growers can use certain approved organic pesticides, but they've also really looked at methods to minimize the impact from pests without using, in a lot of cases, without using any pesticides, and in all cases without using, some of the highly toxic things like neonicotinoids and other systemics. So it's that holistic approach and really thinking about your cropping system. And if you are interested in this, NRCS has a lot of resources. Xerces has a tremendous number of resources, and we have actually partner biologists that are embedded with NRCS that can provide technical assistance to any working lands, anybody who manages working lands for free. So certainly look at our website, look at our Pollinator Resource Center, and reach out to get that technical assistance. It's taken that first step and starting to think about, what can I do? That's the great question. And then there are often options you can move forward with.
Scott, I'm going to go a tiny bit out of order on the questions here just because this is quite related. Can you give examples, brand names, for instance, of neonic pesticides, please?
Well, so the brand names vary. So the way, unfortunately, with insecticides, they have their trade name, but the brand names can vary. So imidacloprid, for instance, is one of the major neonicotinoids that are used, along with clothanidin and several others. But they can come as rose and lawn treatment, or they often are packaged in a way that you won't know that they're in there. So if you're more interested, go to Xerces' website, get on our pesticide page. We've got a brochure that you can look at and download that shows the pesticides and what the products are that they're in. But also turn over the back and look and see if it's got imidacloprid or it's got clothanidin or one of these other neonics. But we do have a handy brochure on our website that lists, and we may be getting more products, so it might not capture 100% of them, but it lists imidacloprid and lists all the products that we know that is in. And the other thing, since we're talking about pesticides, we've got a campaign right now also to try to get people to talk to their nurseries, because some nurseries, especially, but not just some of the larger companies that sell plants, plants can actually be sold that have high levels of neonicotinoids and other toxic insecticides in them. And on that same page, you can get some information on the questions to ask if you're out buying nursery plants, and what you should be asking your nursery manager about what they use, how they use it. And my impression and the way I work is, if they can't tell you where they get their plants or what's been used on them, that might be a good sign that you want to go to a different nursery. Because the worst thing in the world is to buy a pollinator plant. Well, I don't want to say that, because there's many worse things in the world, right? But so I don't want to go that far. But it really isn't great if you buy a pollinator plant and it's got toxic neonicotinoids in it, and you're putting it out there for the benefit of pollinators, and you're potentially impacting them. So important to ask those questions.
Scott, I have a couple related questions. One's perhaps they're just related to me, but one's sort of a larger, broader view, and another is more community based. So one is you mentioned working on the upcoming infrastructure bill to incorporate roadside insect and pollinator habitat. Is there any legislation coming down the pike that you all are working on with regards to pesticide regulation in any way?
You know, we work a lot at the federal, state, and local level on pesticide issues. There are some bills that are out there, like Saving America's Pollinators Act, that are trying to push the envelope on pesticides. They, you know, I will just say that any bill, in getting any bill through Congress is a lot of work, and some of these will have an uphill battle to pass. But one thing you can do is, if you're interested in these subjects, is go to our website and sign up for our e-newsletter alerts. And you know, when we're or our allies are working on specific bills that could use your input and support, you know, those always go out. We try not to post too much. You'll be getting maybe something every week from this as an email, but a lot of useful information in our e-newsletters, including what bills are moving. Another thing that everybody should be aware of is the Farm Bill is coming up again in 2023, and that's a really important piece of legislation that we'll be doing a lot of work on to ensure that we can have as much incentivization for pollinator habitat for farmers and other working lands, and on other working lands like forests and rangelands. So that's a piece of legislation that really people haven't started talking about yet, but boy, next year is going to be a big push.
Very good. And now, sort of more at the community level, how do you think we can better educate people on how to treat their yards organically and make them more aware of the results of the poisons, pesticides, and insecticides that they use?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know, that's a difficult one, but it's one that can work. And I think I'm going to first talk about farmers because I think we can use the same approach. You know, one of the best ways to change or to at least get the attention of farmers is to get a key farmer taking early action and changing the way they do things, right? Farmers are much more liable to listen to other farmers than they are to, you know, potentially even staff at NRCS or others, right? If it's being successful, they'll look at it and go, oh, I might be able to do that. In my own life, I've really tried to do that here where I live. I talk to my neighbors a lot, but much of it is that I have really tried to have a beautiful yard with lots of flowers, growing lots of my own food. And I've got signage out that, you know, says no pesticides used here, and this is pollinator habitat. And I've been able to really talk to lots of my neighbors because they're kind of intrigued. We went from a house that was just all bluegrass and ornamental plants to this tiny spot of grass where we've got our trampoline. I do have kids. And mostly native plants, as well as a lot of blueberries and raspberries and tomatoes, of course, and all of the other crops we grow. And it's really a great way to start these dialogues because people are wondering what you're doing. And I can start talking to them about, you know, you don't need to use the Roundup. You don't need to use the insecticides. You don't need the perfect lawn. And it can start to change the dynamic. So, you know, thinking about how you've done your own yard and then radiating that out and talking. Another way, and something I talk to a lot of folks about, is look at our resources. If you live in a an HOA, you know, what are those? The, you know, area associations that have strict things about what you can do in your yard, go and talk to them. Say, could I come in and talk to you about alternatives, and give good alternatives that people can be successful on. It's how we have to try to move forward. And then it can get more aggressive from there. Unfortunately, sometimes you can't make change, and you need to go to your city council, or you need to talk to your county commissioners and see if you can get a bill passed to change how people manage and use these resources. So I think it's the whole gamut. But I have to say, talking to people, and the more we can talk together as neighbors, I think that has a pretty neat impact. No silver bullet here, really. It's just you got to look at and try different options.
Scott, I'm looking here, and it looks like we have one last question regarding the bee cities. And I'm going to add an extra question to that, which is, how is there a size that a bee city needs to be in population? But the audience question was, are bee and insect houses being set up in those landscapes? So kind of a dual question there. Sorry.
Yeah, well, first I'll answer the size. You can be tiny. You know, we really should call it bee city and town, because there are lots and lots of small towns as part of our bee city network. Just doesn't roll off the tongue, right? Bee city and town, just, you know. So no, you don't need to be a certain size. You need to be incorporated in some way, have some sort of, you don't even really need to be a city, because we've had counties get bee city designation. We've had commonwealths. If you get up into the Northeast, they're not quite a city, they're a commonwealth, but they do have a sort of city government. You have to have some sort of government that can, you know, ratify this and empower this to happen, right? So, but you don't need to be of any size. You know, with bee houses, and the bee houses for native bees, like the blocks of wood that you drill into, you know, bee houses can be very nice educational tools to get people excited about bees, and to get people to think about bees other than honeybees. And they can be fun. They're also used in certain agriculture for apples and things like that. But as a conservation measure, they're really not that great. And if you are, because really we should be thinking about, how can we have natural habitat that provides both the floral resources and the nesting resources for bees. But there is a place for them, I think, with education and for fun. But if you do use them, and some of our bee cities do use these bee houses, we have a fact sheet about how you need to manage them. You don't want too many of them all in one place, because these bees normally don't congregate that close together. And you want to make sure they aren't up for years and years, because they can start to build up diseases in them. So it is a fun thing to do. And I actually do it in my own yard. I just make sure I manage the bee house so that I'm doing it appropriately. And we've definitely got resources on our website. You could even just Google, you know, Mason Bee House, Xerces Society, and find a lot of resources.
Scott, if you don't mind, it looks like we have one last question, and it is back to relating to you know, working within the community. Does Xerces support people by attending HOA for explanations?
Well, you know, we're not small necessarily. We've got 55 staff, but that isn't large when you think of the number of HOAs in the country, right? So it would be difficult for us to attend all the HOAs. But we could certainly provide the resources that you can use to reach out to the HOA. So you should, first look at our website and then follow up with some of the links, pollinators at Xerces.org, for instance, to ask any questions and get the resources you need. We also are getting more and more volunteers. We've got a volunteer ambassador program that these volunteers go through training to be a Xerces ambassador. And they're the type of people that if they live in your state, in your town, that might be able to help you at an HOA or Zoom in at an HOA. So certainly reach out and first look at the resources and reach out there, and we can try to do the best we can help. There are just so many of them that that would be a lot to reach out to all the HOAs we were asked to reach out to.
Just because I'm aware of where that audience member lives, sort of, there's a lot of community groups as well, particularly in our larger cities here in Missouri. So Kansas City has native plant societies and things that would also be good resources as well. Though this ambassador program sounds awesome, and I'm going to look into it as soon as we're off the Zoom. But there are some, community groups that are involved in these issues, certainly in Casey and St. Louis here in Missouri.
Yes, and
Scott,
I know we are training some ambassadors in Missouri, in Kansas City at least. So, reach out and we'll keep you posted when they're trained and might be able to help.
Scott, we just have a couple of comments for you here in the chat in Whova, which is wonderful presentation and thank you for all you do. That was echoed a few times. And in the Zoom chat, amazing, phenomenal, scientifically sound, yet understandable. Thank you so much. So.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that. I really do appreciate it and really excited to be able to share with you this way. Maybe in a future time, once we're fully past COVID, I'll have to come out and visit the area again. I, of course, grew up in Nebraska and used to drive across Missouri a lot to go down to the Ozarks because it was one of my favorite places to go. So I'm always happy to come and visit Missouri.
Wonderful. When we are past COVID, you will be invited.
That's great. All right. Well, thank you all. Very much appreciated. Have a great weekend. And I hope you enjoy the festivities tomorrow and it doesn't rain on you too much.
We'll see. We'll see. Thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you. Bye-bye.